Okay, now at the time of Umar radiallahu anh, this is some facts about Umar. Umar ibn Khattab, born in the 40, died 23, and then these are some second Khalifa. Okay, Umar radiallahu anhu, in fact, it was very interesting about Umar radiallahu anhu. Umar radiallahu was actually a judge, a qadi. He was a qadi, a judge, before Islam. So before Islam, he was actually, he was literate, right? So that was an advantage he had. And people would come to him to resolve their disputes anyway. So he had experience of how to deal with people from before. Okay, now I've actually missed out some important sort of like slides which I added into my Evolution of Fiqh course, which were basically about the political context, what was happening politically at that time, and all these political issues would have definitely had an effect on the shaping of fiqh. Just like today, with, for example, like if a person looks 500 years into the future and looks at the decisions that scholars made in 2021 around the world and didn't know about the COVID-19 situation, they might not have a good idea of why the scholars made certain decisions, right? So we've seen in our times today, for example, like the issue of gaps in the masjid when you're praying in the safs and you got gaps in there, or the issue of, can you pray Jummah online? And the issue of cancellation of Umrah or Hajj for many people, issues related to praying Taraweeh, in your house, and all other things, right? So when you understand, oh yeah, there was this global pandemic and it was affecting everyone, and it was even affecting religious people and non-religious people, everyone was affected by this, and it stopped people from being able to contact each other. Then there makes sense of the fatwas that were released by scholars, so has some sort of a backdrop to it. So it's very important whenever you're learning about how fiqh developed over the years, you look at what was happening in that time, because it kind of gives it away of the things that were motivating people to issue those fatwas. So, okay, economically, the Muslims had now become very strong. Right? Muslims were richer than they had ever been now. So as money was coming into the Islamic system, Umar radiallahu anhu, he organized the Baytul Mal. So the Baytul Mal became not just like it was, in the early years, it was just basically to the mosque. Whatever money, wealth came in from expeditions and all that would just be left in the mosque, and the Prophet ﷺ would distribute it amongst the community. Now you had lots of problems because you had lots of wealth coming in, and there were different types of wealth, so you can't mix it all together. So he devised the Baytul Mal system in a very, very refined manner, in an organized manner. Number two is the compilation of corpuses. Compilation of corpuses is because he saw that the Persians were a very big population, and they had everyone's names documented. Every area, every locality, every borough had the names of the population, the residents documented, the men, the women, the children, those who are married and divorced, etc. Everyone's names were documented. So he said, why don't we start something similar? Why don't we adopt something from the Persians? So that's what he done. So he called these the Diwans, right? So he began to compile these corpuses, and everyone's names were in there. So let's say, for example, he wanted to know how many widows there are in the community, so he could distribute wealth accordingly to the widows, and how many orphans were there, or how many people who didn't have a job or who were unemployed. So he had all of this sort of like mapped out. Setting of wages. So interestingly, what he began to do was he began to set the wages of soldiers. So previously, in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, soldiers did not have a wage. It was just a matter of, guys, volunteers, everyone get ready, we're going to go for battle. And then the booty of war was distributed if they won. But there wasn't like a specific wage. But this time what he done is he began to employ soldiers now. So training them up, paying them a wage. And then whenever there's a need for battle, they'd be ready and they'd be sent out. So setting up wages is a new thing this was. Setting up trade regulations. Another interesting thing that he done was he started to officially set up trade regulations, because now markets were growing. He saw that people are now going to try to take advantage of vulnerable people, and he set up this kind of market. So there's many interesting narrations about how he, number one, he would himself go to the markets and he would ask about goods. How much are you selling this for? Why are you selling this like this for? Where are you getting your stock from? He would investigate, just so that people were not cheating the system. And he would also tell all the sellers they had to be aware of the Islamic finance rulings. Right? So the Islamic finance rulings of that time, you needed to be aware of those to qualify to sell in the markets. So, okay. Now, in that time, there was also judges that were sent out. The judges were basically the early muftis, right? So a judge is basically a mufti who has the power to enforce the law, right? So he's got two powers over there. So he answers people's questions and he's the judge as well. So the Prophet ﷺ had already started the system of sending out judges. And the reason simply is because if the Muslims are growing, people need to have knowledge. Knowledge and wealth are two important things for development of any society. So the Prophet ﷺ, from early years, he would send out people like Mu'adh radiallahu anhu was sent out to Yemen. And so this idea of judges and answering people's questions is a very important thing in Islam, that people should have access to knowledge. People should have access to experts that they can ask their questions to. And the early years, the scholars were very particular. Governments were very particular about this. So judges were very important. Some of the famous judges in the time of Umar radiallahu anhu, in fact, there's actually a book, it's called Al-Qudat by Sheikh Muhammad Zuhaili. Sheikh Muhammad Zuhaili has a book called Qudat, and he's basically gone from the time of the Prophet ﷺ all the way till like later eras, hundreds and hundreds of years into the future. He's listed as many judges that were documented in Islamic history. Yeah, so judges that took posts, he listed them, whether they were men or whether they were women, he's listed them. And that's a very important book for scholars, so that you can understand who was considered to be an authority in answering questions. So like on the screen, you can see Abu Musa al-Ash'ari was made a judge. Shuraih is the only guy on the list who's not a Sahabi. And this was because Umar radiallahu anhu once had a dispute, and Shuraih was there, this guy Shuraih, and Shuraih said, can I answer the question? So he answered the question. Umar was so impressed. He realized this guy was very talented at answering questions. So he made him the judge. He appointed him as judge, and he was a judge for 60 years. So imagine, he's a judge answering Sahaba's questions. So Sahaba are coming to him and he's giving them verdicts, right, based upon, ijtihad. So Shuraih is a very important figure. Ammar bin Yasir and Ibn Mas'ud, these are two important figures as well, who were, governors and at the same time judges as well, right? So Umar radiallahu anhu would regularly monitor the judges, right? So he had this sort of system where he would regularly send out messages to them, letters to them, and he would also do spot checks. So he would randomly turn up at one city and he would ask for, like if the judgments, rulings had been recorded, he'd ask for them. He'd ask, how do you answer the questions? Yeah, how are you living? Where's your expenses coming from? And all that. So Umar radiallahu anhu was very particular about this. So this is one of the things that he used to do. And a bit later on, I'm going to show you an example of or a summary of a letter that he sent out to some of his governors. And these letters, I would say, are the early manuals of fiqh. So the early manuals of fiqh that slowly began to develop over the years. You can say that Umar radiallahu anhu was the founder of them. Okay, another aspect was education. He knew education was extremely important, because if you don't have education in the society, then Islam can never grow as a religion. So number one, what he did was he appointed teachers, right? He got teachers in communities, he chose them, and he made them teachers. He paid the wages of the teachers on. So this was like for the first time now, the government is providing money to teachers to teach for free, right? So they're teaching the people for free, but they're getting paid by the government. He also done an interesting thing. He built cities from scratch, cities of knowledge. So one of the most famous cities that he built was Kufa. Kufa is a city that's now found in Iraq. This was a city that he built from scratch. And the way that he done it was basically, what he done was he sent to that city the sort of like the expert Sahaba. He sent them there, right? And he also sent Arab tribes there who were well known for their Arabic. So the Arab tribes would basically preserve the Arabic language in that community, because whenever, let's say someone knows English, right? Like I know English, kind of. And let's say I go to live in another community for many years and I don't speak that much English. What's going to happen is slowly my English is going to become affected. And Umar knew that if Arabic becomes affected, people's understanding of the Quran will become affected. because in them days they had no dictionaries. So you had like no Google or anything. Or what does this word in the Quran mean? What tini was zaytun? What does that mean? Let me have a little check. You could quickly Google it. But in them days, where are you going to go? There's no library. So this was like in them days, the answer to a dictionary. You basically live amongst a tribe who are known for their Arabic dialect. So he actually transferred big tribes, paid them, they moved them over, they shifted them entirely, and you had experts living there as well. Kufa became such a bustling city afterwards, right? It became actually one of the most like it was speaker's corner of the Muslim world, but a good speaker's corner, yeah, a nice one. And there was like all these different groups there. You had, Sunnis there, you had Shia there, you had Mu'tazila there, you had even Khawarij were there, you had non-Muslims there, Zoroastrians, others, and they would like live amongst each other. There would be debates taking place there. So it was a very, very important city, as we're going to see later on. And finally, knowledge, right? So the spreading of knowledge, Umar radiallahu anhu was very sort of particular about that as well. Okay, so these are some of the cities of knowledge in his era that he developed. Makkah, Medina, Basra, right? Kufa, Sham. Sham is all of Palestine and Jordan and Syria, Lebanon. All this area is known as Sham, and Egypt as well. So these became centers of knowledge. Now, in the time of Umar radiallahu anhu, Sahaba who originally were sent there for being governors or for being judges, began to develop their own students over there. And now they began to disseminate knowledge over there. So you can imagine it like a drop. When a drop hits the water, ripple effect, and starts spreading. These Sahaba were like the drops that were falling in the water and creating ripple effects in the community of knowledge. So these various cities now were starting to become centers of knowledge now, right? These were the foundations of centers of knowledge. So, and this is where they're roughly located. In them days, these are the kind of names they were known for. Kufa, you can see in the top right-hand corner. And you got Basra, which is found by the Euphrates River. And then you got on the other side, Fustat. Yeah, Fustat was, where you have Egypt starting. And then you got Medina and Mecca. Okay, so these were like the cities. So now in them days, let's say someone wanted to do an Alim course, Alimiya course, yeah? What would they have to study in the Alimiya course? They have to study three things. They already know Arabic anyway. Arabic is their mother tongue. They know Arabic. They would have to study three things: Quran, Sunnah, and poetry. Arabic poetry was necessary if you want to truly understand and have the precise understanding of the Quran. Yeah, so Quran, Sunnah, and poetry, very important. And so what Umar began to do, he began to focus a lot on poetry as well. Yeah, and he actually built in Masjid Nabawi, next to Masjid Nabawi, adjacent to it, he built an area known as Butayha. It's called Butayha, where people could sing poetry. So he didn't want to stop poetry. He didn't want to stop this singing of poetry, but he said to the people, if you need to do it over there. So poetry was seen as something that was a way of preserving language and culture. Language and culture was preserved in, this oral transmission of their language and the classical poets. So this was continued. So this is what you had. Now, Umar radiallahu anhu, he actually observed another problem that was slowly appearing in the society. That was the problem of making mistakes in recitation of the Quran, right? Because if you imagine it, the early people who learned the Quran from the Prophet ﷺ, they're obviously going to be very good at it. But then the new Muslims who are entering into Islam, they're not going to have the same set of skills of Arabic language to be able to read Quran as good as the early people, right? It's like, for example, many of us are born and brought up Muslim. If you have someone that comes from a different country who has many of us are born and brought up speaking English, and rephrase that. And then many people who come to this country and are learning English, they find certain basic things that we can, know from with the back of our hand. They find it difficult to learn. So one of the things was these the pronunciation of the vowels. So look at this verse. Anna Allah bari'un min al-mushrikina wa rasuluhu. Right. So this verse was actually Anna Allah bari'un min al-mushrikina wa rasuluhu. See, this is rasuluhu. So once he heard someone reciting this, and what this verse basically means is Allah is free from the mushriks, and so is his messenger free from the mushriks. Now, someone read it like this: أن الله بريء من المشركين ورسوله, with a kasra. Yeah, رسوله. Yeah. Or like some of you guys might have learned it, زير. So what's the difference between the two? The difference is, the second meaning is this: Allah is free from two people, the mushriks and his messenger, which obviously is not what the Quran is saying. Now, if you have this kind of deteriorating understanding of Quran recitation, you can imagine how in the future generations people will no longer be able to recognize the Quran anymore. Yeah. So immediately he became, concerned about this, and he began to encourage he said, first of all, he said, no one can teach the Quran unless you are expert in Arabic poetry. You must be an expert in Arabic poetry, because if you're an expert in Arabic poetry, you're not going to make these little mistakes.